everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of The County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. Today we will be having a discussion about PILT, payment in lieu of taxes. You know, in county government, we get our services and they are covered mostly by paying property taxes. But what happens in a county where you have vast tracts of federal public land? And they still require police service, fire, they have to respond to fires, search and rescue, road maintenance, and a list of other activities. So how do you cover the costs of those activities when the federal lands themselves, by law, are exempt from property taxes?
The agreement that Utah made when it entered the Union was that it would not tax the undesignated federal lands within its boundaries. The understanding at the time was that at some point in the future, those lands would be transferred from federal ownership to state or private property. From the time Utah entered the Union in 1896 until 1976, and the passage of the Federal Lands Policy Management Act, or FLPMA, there was a shift in national policy from the sale and disposal of federal lands to retention and conservation. This created a hardship for counties that had very little private land for a tax base and large tracts of federal land that couldn't be taxed but still required county services. In 1982, the Federal Lands Management Policy Act was amended by Congress to include PILT, or payment in lieu of taxes, to make up for the losses in property tax due to non-taxable land within the county. PILT laid out a dollar amount to be paid per acre dependent upon population of up to 50,000 people.
It's a payment by the federal government to an individual county for the land which the federal government owns, to which the county performs services, just like it does to any landowner. If you own a home, you're receiving services, you're paying a tax for the services that you receive. In the case of the federal government, you can't tax them directly, of course. So the Congress passed what they call a payment in lieu of the tax. It's a property tax, just like a property service fee, just like anyone else who owns property is required to pay. It offsets the cost the county has to provide services because they're providing road maintenance across those lands, they're providing garbage collection and pickup on many of those lands, providing search and rescue for people who get lost on those lands. So yeah, there's a benefit to the people that are using it. To the county, it's a partial payment for the cost that they expend to have the land in their county and have to provide the service. It's not a full payment.
While PILT seemed to be a solution for counties with large tracts of federal land and a small tax base, it wasn't until 2008 that Congress finally fully funded PILT.
Yeah, it's just been the last 6 or 7 years that PILT has been fully funded. You know, it was passed in 1976 with FLPMA, and when I was first elected in '96, we were about 30% funded, and then gradually worked up. I mean, it was an annual thing going back to Congress and lobbying for PILT. I did that every year for a number of years, and then Congressman Hansen finally got us up to about 60–70% fully funded, and then it was fully funded and guaranteed for a 5-year period. The last 2 years we've been back on a year-to-year basis, and it's you know, it's really not fair to the counties to do that. This is something that we get because the government has so much control of our lands and doesn't pay any property tax on anything, and so this ought to be an automatic payment to us.
The counties, unlike the federal government, are statutorily required to have a balanced budget every year. The uncertainty created by a year-to-year decision by Congress on whether to pay PILT and at what rate makes the budgeting process for counties difficult because there's no way to know how many dollars will be coming from the federal government. County budgets are typically decided by the end of December, but the payments from PILT don't come until June.
First of all, we budget our county to provide the services to those lands that are not privately held or state held, and then we anticipate a payment from the federal government. And in Iron County, the full amount that we have, that we budget for, comes from kind of a formula that they use with based on population and total of acreage.
19 of Utah's counties last year received over $1 million each in PILT funding. Statewide, a total of $35 million for 32 million acres of public land. That was the status in 2013. When we come back, we will take a look at PILT. We will take a look at the wild and erratic journey it's taken to get to funding this year after this commercial break.
Cedar City, Utah is home of the Tony Award-winning Utah Shakespeare Festival. But did you know that we also offer a different kind of play?
Escape the gray. Head south for clear skies. Cedar City, Bryan Head. It's where play is the thing.
Making sure your food is safe. It starts on the farm and continues every step of the way, all the way to your local grocery store. So when you bring home food for your family, you do so with the peace of mind that it's safe, fresh, and nutritious. Utah Department of Agriculture and Food, the guardians of Utah's food supply and sustainable agriculture. Visit ag.utah.gov for more information.
The best part about raising children here in Vernal and the Uinta Basin is just the smaller community that makes you feel like when you go somewhere, you know everybody.
So we packed up our 3 kids and here we came to Uinta County. And what a great place it was. What a great move. Great schools, great outdoor activities. Just a really great place to raise your family.
My father, he was an engineer for Chevron, retired 39 some odd years. And Jeff, my husband, it's the same way. He's always worked in the oil and gas, always had a job here. And with that industry, when it does good, the whole valley thrives.
Uinta Basin's been fantastic in supporting what we've tried to do both as a business and also in the development of mountain bike trails and the sport of mountain biking.
I'm able to run up to a beautiful place like this and spend some good quality time. It's one of the big reasons why I live where I live.
And that makes it just a wonderful place to have little ones like this.
Kanab, base camp for your southern Utah adventures. You belong in Kanab.
How would you spend an extra day in Utah Valley? Stay one more day. Visit utahvalley.com to make reservations. Utah Valley. Bring everyone together.
Welcome back to the county seat. If you're just joining us today, we're having a conversation about PILT, payment in lieu of taxes. It is a fee that the federal government pays to the counties for services on federal lands within the county. They are paying this fee because they recognize that the counties are unable to collect property tax to cover the cost of those services. But just how important are PILT funds as a part of a county's budget? Well, it depends. It depends upon a formula of the acreage of federal government land within your county as well as your population.
We're right at somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,100 square miles of area out here. 7,000 people, 7,100 people in our 2010 census live in Kane County. When you look at our county and its unrestricted budgets, we operate everything from road building and road maintenance to search and rescue and law enforcement, all the other services such as recorders and the courts and all. We're right around $8 million. PILT is $1 million deal to us, and it's just right at 12% of our budget. And without PILT, that means something will have to be dropped. And more than likely, it'll be our people that have to pick up the slack on that, and we don't think that that's necessary.
We've been getting about $2.7 million the last several years from PILT, and So that's a big part of our budget. You know, it's 10% or so of the budget. It basically funds our patrol division on the sheriff's department, and we used the last couple of years. We've used a little bit on roads as well. So it's a big part. We calculated that, you know, if we had to replace it, it would be about a 30% raise in the county's portion of the property tax. That's not the overall property tax.
The 30% increase would be an additional $40.56 on a $250,000 home in Washington County, which is a relatively large county. That number could be much higher in counties with a small tax base and a large amount of federal lands. For example, the same $250,000 property in Beaver County would see a $138 increase on their county portion of their taxes. In fact, each county would feel the sting very differently if PILT were to go away.
The county's portion of property taxes, we'd have to raise that about 69% in order to make up the same dollar amount of $3.1 million in PILT that comes to Tooele County. What that would likely translate into for the majority of our taxpayers is somewhere between $60 and $70 per year.
Your smaller counties with huge amounts of public lands, your counties like Garfield, Wayne, Paiute, just where the tax base is so slim, the commercial tax base, the property tax base. First of all, the amount of taxable lands in those counties are just like on the order of 2, 3, 4% of the total land mass, and there isn't a whole lot of commercial valuation there to tax. So those kind of counties really take it really hard.
In Iron County, we are approximately 60% federally owned. And as a result of that, we receive approximately $3.1 million in the form of PILT, or payment in lieu of taxes. For kind of simple terms, it's right around 14 to 17% of our total operating budget in the county. And you know, so without those funds to operate with, we would have to dramatically evaluate and probably reduce services because that proportionate amount of services is tied to that anticipated revenues.
For counties, it is not as simple as raising taxes or cutting services. In many cases, further reduction in services may not even be an option, especially for counties that are already stripped down to the bare bones.
If PILT doesn't come through, we have a much more immediate problem than taxes being raised potentially could address. Even if we were to talk about a tax shift of that much money that we've collected from PILT, that won't help us until 2015 at the earliest, because we would have to signal at the end of this year, because of the way that the truth in taxation hearings go, that we would be advertising that in 2015 we would look to increase those taxes and collect them at the end of 2015. We just passed a budget that factored in PILT being paid this year. So what will we do, given that the last 18 months saw us trim 25% of our workforce, or roughly 100 employees? And so, like I've mentioned, one of those would be capital projects, roads mainly, that would have to be shelved for at least a year, maybe 2. The problem with that is the maintenance costs grow when you don't take care of a road that's got the alligator cracks in it, and you can't do the tar treatment this year. You start to see an exponential worsening of that with every year that you have to delay such projects. So it's not a reality we want to face, but we don't have much more staff that we can cut. And we don't have many more elective services that we could cut.
One of the difficulties we've pointed out so far in our conversation is that counties have a difficult time anticipating how many federal tax dollars they will get in their PILT funding each year. Well, that's primarily because Congress funds it year by year, and they never know exactly how that funding is going to pan out.
Last year, the challenge for counties was federal sequestration, which made about a 5% cut. But this year, the latest budget didn't even include PILT at all, leaving 1,850 counties in 49 states without the necessary funds to offset losses in tax revenue because of federal ownership within their boundaries. The loss of PILT nationwide could create a much bigger problem when counties are anticipating that revenue in their budgets.
Oh, it's huge. I say it's $415 million on a national basis. The biggest impact is in the West.
Starting at the time of the government shutdown in October, PILT funding had been placed in doubt until this last week. That development paralyzed the county planning process across rural America. We spoke with Ryan Yates, the Associate Legislative Director for Public Lands for the National Association of Counties, by telephone to get a chronology of the roller coaster of events involving PILT.
It began in October, at the beginning of the fiscal year, as counties began providing services to the public on the notion that the federal government would come through with that obligation. So as we moved through government shutdowns of last fall and into the continuing resolutions and the larger appropriations debate in Congress, the idea that an omnibus appropriations bill would come together in the first part of the year provided what many thought would be an opportune legislative vehicle for funding of PILT. And so the counties across the nation, many governors, the Western Governors Association, countless members of Congress, both from the Senate and the House, really began putting a lot of pressure on leadership on both sides to use that omnibus appropriations bill as a way to fund the PILT program. Ultimately, that Sunday when we found out that PILT would not be funded, it really sent shockwaves through at least the local government world.
Most recently, PILT funding has found a home in the Farm Bill, at least for this year. And the next couple of days, the passage of that bill will allow many county officials to breathe a sigh of relief. But there is still the larger problem.
I believe that the county is too dependent upon an unreliable source of revenue. I don't have disdain for PILT per se, because I believe that it is the federal government's obligation, as long as they're expecting us to, as counties, fund certain expenses, they ought to be paying into the same system like property tax owners that are residential or commercial are. So I wouldn't call that disdain, but it does seem that we're too reliant upon an otherwise unknown amount of our general fund. It's about 15%, and that's a bit nerve-wracking.
When we come back, we will analyze and look at some alternatives the counties may face if PILT funding fails to materialize in future years. Stay with us. We'll be back with the county seat.
I didn't order this.
Compliments of the lady in gold.
Hello, trouble.
Anything worth doing in this quiet little town? You look like the kind of man that could show a girl a good time.
You strike me as the kind of girl that likes a manicure and a massage.
How's that for a manicure?
I hate golf.
I was hoping for something a little more vigorous.
Vigorous, I can do.
And I thought you'd be riding side saddle.
What? I'm gonna regret this. How about that manicure?
Almost 45% of the oil produced in Utah, 7.8 million barrels, comes from Duchesne County. That oil feeds our state economy, provides job growth, and supports local business. Here in Duchesne County, we're working to make Utah an economic, cultural, and technological leader. Whether you're here for business or pleasure, Duchesne County will welcome you with open arms and invite you to explore all the beauty of the Uinta Mountains. Duchesne County, close enough for business, far enough to get away.
Have you ever wanted to recreate the world around you? Add some excitement, culture, adventure? Well, there's no need to remake the world when that perfect combination already exists. Just remember 4 words. Welcome to Weber County. In Ogden, you'll find everything you're looking for, from the top of Powder Mountain to the restaurants of our revitalized downtown. Ogden, Utah, mountain to metro and everything in between. Visit Ogden.com.
Rediscover your sense of adventure. Welcome to San Juan County. Discover the past. A change of place. Utah, San Juan County.
where life is elevated.
Skiing is expensive, right? Well, how about we do something about that? Eagle Point, Southern Utah's premier resort located right outside of Beaver, Utah, is proud to announce $25 lift tickets all season long. Ski and snowboard Utah's newest resort for the lowest price, and find out why the Point, with its family-friendly staff and great atmosphere, will become your second home. $25 lift passes all season. Go to eaglepointresort.com for eligibility and restrictions. 5 lifts, 40 named runs, 1,500 vertical feet. Endless possibilities. Eagle Point Resort.
Welcome back to the county seat. So far today we have been talking about payment in lieu of taxes, a fee that the federal government pays to counties. We've also talked about how important these funds are as a proportion of counties' operating budgets. But what would counties do if indeed those funds went away?
Because of the last 18 months and what Tooele County has faced with our financial situation, we have already begun addressing 2 elements of our funding that have been short-term in nature or up for question, like PILT is, with our citizens this past year. As we've addressed citizens, these short-term monies have been used to pay for long-term projects. We have to ask ourselves as a local community, a local jurisdiction, do we want certain services to be thought of more permanently, and if so, are we prepared as citizens here to pay for them in the event that mitigation fees dry up or PILT goes away or is greatly reduced? And very recently, in the last couple of months, we've even mentioned that at our county commission meetings with the expectation that we are beginning that dialogue. Our vehicle for that has been the addressing of PILT specifically with the municipal service tax. And so right now that is the process that we expect to undertake with and including some town hall meetings late spring, early summer to address just this, which is to say, if this is historically how we've been using and allocating PILT monies when we've received them, if they go away, do we, the citizens, want those services reduced, or are we willing to pay more in additional taxes that the local government imposes in order to guarantee that those extra taxes collected will first and foremost guarantee ongoing providing of these services, and if we continue to receive monies like PILT or mitigation fees, it's extra, it's discretionary. It might give us fluff that if they go away, those are the first things cut.
While one route seeks to cut services or raise taxes, another alternative would be to find a reliable source of predictable revenue.
We'd like to see a permanent solution by using Land and Water Conservation Fund. That's money that comes from offshore oil, and currently there's about $1 billion a year that's in that figure that's designated to go towards purchase of private lands by the federal government. We'd say, you know, you've bought enough of those lands, let's take some of that money and pay the bills you've got on PILT and other things. We'd like to see that, you know, has a good potential of being a revenue source to fund PILT. Because that's the issue now, is they have to have an offset to do it, and so, you know, funding, everybody agrees to PILT that it's necessary, but, you know, how do you fund it's the question.
Beyond the solutions of how to plan for the disappearance of PILT or finding a permanent funding source, there is also the idea that there is a much larger problem, particularly in the West. A problem that fundamentally revolves around the disproportionate amount of land that the federal government controls within a number of the western states and counties.
Okay, this is House Bill 148, Transfer of Public Lands Act and related study.
I guess this just reemphasizes the need to have the lands transferred to the state so that we can use our natural resources and generate the revenue that potentially is out there.
Given the fact that every local county with large portions of federal lands, they are dependent to a small degree on those revenues because of that ownership interest. And if that ownership interest, if they're not going to treat it as an obligation that they have, they need to discharge that obligation and bring it back to the states. In fact, even if they were continuing to pay the PILT, the country, our wonderful country, the United States, is in jeopardy.
The apparent inability of the federal government to manage these lands for their intended purpose, which was to raise revenue for the U.S. Treasury, and the potential earnings that lie in these lands through responsible development, is widening what was once called the Sagebrush Rebellion into an alliance of many more states. Here's Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski on the subject.
The federal government's broke here. We can't continue to pay counties to not utilize the lands within their boundaries. And Mr. Chairman, you have appropriately suggested where we need to go with this. You need to be able to access the resources that are on your lands. We either need to utilize our federal lands to generate the revenue and the jobs for our rural communities, or we should divest the federal government of those lands and let the states or the counties, the boroughs manage them.
PILT debate is artificial. It's caught up in today's ideology as far as what's going on with the federal budget. And now somebody has to pay, and they start with us. And I think we would say basically, you guys don't pay your PILT bill, well, we're going to put your federal property up for auction.
I think as we look at the larger discussion of federal land transfer, I think that it's a very timely discussion. You know, many communities that are unhappy with land management decisions at the federal level, frankly, many believe that the states may be a better manager of those lands, and you know, it begs the question, you know, who should own these lands? And the federal government permanently owns over 600 million acres of land in this country in which you know, those decisions affect people. I think that's a permanent thing. I think as local governments are unable to collect property taxes to pay for services on that large federal estate, the federal government needs to find a permanent solution to paying its fair share.
This conversation today does need to recognize that Congress is aware of the difficulties that face counties in PILT funding, and for the time being they have found an answer. But it still begs the question of what happens when the makeup of Congress changes and that membership is different. Will it also bring a change of heart and leave Utah's rural counties bearing the brunt of some really difficult financial decisions? You know, it takes that concept, which was one time called crazy talk, of a transfer of public lands, and sheds a new light on it, making it a much more reasonable proposition to consider. Thank you for watching today on the County Seat. Remember, local government is where your life happens. Become involved in the conversation and be a part of the solution. We welcome your comments at our Facebook page, thecountyseat.tv, and you can join our blog discussion. It goes through the week on our website, thecountyseat.tv. Thanks for being with us. We'll look for you next week on The County Seat.